Astrotheology is a term that's been used a lot of different ways, and so that can actually be a little bit of a confusing term. But the way that I'm using it here has to do with the study of the evidence that the world's ancient scriptures are based on some kind of astral or heavenly metaphor. A lot of times, astrotheology is specifically talking about the episodes in the Old and New Testaments of the Bible, so-called. And a lot of times that metaphor that they're talking about is very focused on the motions of the sun. So astrotheology is a lot of times used to say, well, you know, the 12 disciples in the New Testament, or the 12 children of Israel in the Hebrew scriptures, are based on the motions of the sun and its motion through the annual cycle of the zodiac, the 12 houses or 12 signs of the zodiac. So a lot of times it's confined to focusing on the stories in the Bible, and a lot of times the analysis doesn't go very far beyond the solar metaphor. But I actually believe that virtually all the world's ancient myths, scriptures, and sacred stories can be shown to be based on celestial metaphor, and not just solar metaphor, but actually tied to specific, very specific characteristics of various constellations. Not just the constellations that make up the zodiac band, although those are extremely important constellations in the metaphors that are found in the ancient myths, but actually all of the constellations, as well as the motions of the visible planets, the sun and the moon, other celestial features such as the Milky Way, and the celestial cycles, the annual cycle, the daily cycle, the moon, the lunar cycle, and even longer cycles such as the precessional cycle. The reason I called this latest book Astrotheology for Life is because first I am explaining more of the system that's often called astrotheology. I think a better term might be astromythology, but not only am I explaining some of the outlines of the system of celestial metaphor that underlines the world's myths, but also how it applies to our life, how this system of celestial metaphor is actually designed to convey profound truths that have application for our daily life. Not just for our individual lives, but for where we are right now at this particular point in history. It's a very crucial time. I believe that the ancient wisdom that's contained in the world's myths and scriptures and sacred stories has a lot to say for where we are in history right now and the choice that we face between life and death. So the word ecotype is a term that is used to mean a family or a pattern that surfaces again and again in the myths around the world. The word was coined by a folklorist who noticed these patterns in folklores of different cultures and different fairy tales, how the same pattern seems to crop up again and again. The word oikos means household, or our word economics comes from the Greek word oikos. So it's like a family of myths, a myth pattern. For instance, there's a pattern in which a baby is cast adrift in either the ocean or in a river. This is a very common pattern that surfaces again and again throughout the world's sacred stories. It's found in the Hebrew scriptures, of course, when baby Moses is placed among the bulrushes in the Nile River, but it's also found in the story of Karna in the Mahabharata, the Sanskrit epic of ancient India. It's also found in the story of Hiruko, who is the leech child that's found in the Kojiki of ancient Japan. And this is a pattern that surfaces again and again around the world in very different cultures, very different time periods even. There's also a story of the ancient king Sargon of Akkad in ancient Mesopotamia, who was placed into a basket by his mother and set adrift amongst the reeds. So an ecotype, or a myth pattern, is a pattern that surfaces over and over in the myths of the world, and there are many very important myth patterns that I examine in Astrotheology for Life. The reason I arranged much of the book by ecotype or myth pattern is because in order to help others to learn this system, it's like learning a language. It's the language of the stars that the ancient myths are speaking. And in order to become more adept at spotting these patterns, instead of just looking specifically at one myth and then seeing how that relates to the stars, which that can be helpful, but then in order for you to be able to go to maybe a completely different myth that's not covered in any of my books or writings, by learning how to spot the patterns, then you can start to learn how to decode the myths for yourself, even when you're encountering an unfamiliar myth or a new myth to you. So by grouping it by pattern and by looking at some suggestions of what these particular myth patterns may be trying to tell us, the hope is that you'll be able to go to the myths on your own and ask them what they're trying to tell you. And by having looked at numerous patterns, you'll become more skilled or more fluent in the language of the myths. Well, we don't really know where these ancient myths came from, because they are so ancient, they predate the most ancient civilizations that we know of. We can already see celestial metaphor, very sophisticated celestial metaphor, operating in the very earliest texts of which we have knowledge at this time. In the pyramid texts, which are some of the most ancient texts that we have in their original form at this time, they're already operating in the ancient tablets of Mesopotamia, such as the Gilgamesh cycle of myths. They're already operating in the Sanskrit Vedas of ancient India. They're in the myths of ancient China and in the Tao Te Ching. So the source of these ancient myths must be even more ancient than the most ancient known civilizations. And I believe that it's very possible that there was a much more ancient culture, a now forgotten culture, a culture of great spiritual sophistication, evidently, based on the incredible sophistication of these ancient myths, that may be the source, the original source for all the different variations that we see in the various cultures of the world around the globe. Obviously, that totally upends the conventional timeline of ancient history, and there are many authors who have proposed, based on other evidence and evidence that they find in the myths, but also evidence from the megalithic structures around the world and the precision and the mathematical knowledge that's encoded in some of these megalithic ancient structures, that there must have been a lost civilization or an extremely ancient culture that's been completely left out or written out of the conventional timeline. The evidence in the world's myths is supporting evidence. It's a whole nother body of evidence. The fact that they're all based on what can be shown to be a common system of celestial metaphor, even as early as the pyramid texts or the Gilgamesh epics, cycles that are written on the Mesopotamian tablets, shows that there must have been some predecessor culture or civilization, just like authors such as John Anthony West and Graham Hancock and Robert Schoch have been arguing now for decades. As we examine these patterns that surface in the myths around the world, and we see that they're all closely connected, we realize that we've been cut off, particularly in what we call the West. And the shape of the world as it is today is very much a product of the types of choices that we've made, but also a product of being cut off from this ancient stream of wisdom. And there are cultures in the world where that stream has survived. And yet the situation that we have today is very much a struggle between two different visions of the way things are and the way we're supposed to act. And the vision that is encoded in these ancient scriptures and ancient myths is very different from the vision that has brought us to the place that we are today. And I believe that the situation we're in is very much a product of being cut off from that ancient wisdom. And therefore I think that we're probably always at a crossroads, but we're certainly at a crossroads now. The myths have a lot to teach us for our lives today. We should listen to them in the language that they're actually speaking. And I believe that's a celestial language. And so by learning more about that language and starting to understand its grammar and its logic and its vocabulary, then we can start to learn what they're trying to convey to us, what this precious inheritance, this worldwide inheritance that was given as the ancient sacred traditions of virtually every culture on the planet is trying to convey to us for our lives and for our benefit today.